Great. Well, welcome everybody to another persuasion debate, www.persuasion.community. I'm really particularly looking forward to this one, I have to say, both because I feel like I've been a little bit complacent. My personal preference as to who should win this election should be relatively evident. And I feel like things are looking reasonably good. So I'm generally heartened about the election, but I'm wondering whether I'm baking in too much that things will continue to look how they look right now, 2 or 3 months from now. So I'm excited to think through this today. And I'm particularly excited to have two great friends join me for the debate. I tweeted the great Sarah Longwell and Matt Bennett. So now I'll say the great Matt Bennett and Sarah Longwell, who both do important and impressive things around Washington, D.C. To save liberal democracy. We will do this as usual. We'll kick off hearing from each of them and then have a real good debate. And then I really look forward to all of your thoughts and questions towards the end. Sarah, why don't we start with you? I mean, the polls do look at the moment as though Joe Biden will win the election, and it even looks as though he might win the election by quite a lot, potentially a landslide. Do you think that is in fact what will happen? Do you think I'm being too complacent in what the next 2 or 3 months are going to look like? Give me the state of play for the race.
I would urge anybody against complacency. I don't know if I could make a judgment call on you particular being too complacent, but no one ought to be complacent. Look, I would liken what's happening right now. I'm not huge on sports analogies, but let's just say it's a basketball game. Your team's up by 12 points. You're feeling pretty good going into halftime, thinking, yeah, this looks pretty good. And then, you come back for the second half, you're starting, point guard blows out his knee, and a bunch of other things start to go wrong, and pretty soon it's catastrophic. You find yourself down by 6 points. Their best player starts lighting it up, hitting threes the whole time. These things happen, right? And there's a lot of game left to play. And not only is there a lot of game left to play, but not that this is a game. This is extremely serious. Democracy is at stake. But one of the things that I do focus groups all the time with what I would call soft Trump supporters. So these are people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, but rate him as either doing somewhat bad or very bad now. And many of them are quite gettable for Joe Biden. But one of the things I hear all the time is how little attention they've been paying up until this point. So for a lot of people, this whole thing is just starting, and we're going into the phase of the campaign where people really start looking at these candidates, and what they have right now tend to be impressions based on really broad things, both whatever money each side is dumping into defining the other, as well as sort of the big stories of the day. And so, I hear from a lot of people in these focus groups who do not like Donald Trump at all, but voted for him, or institutionally Republicans, that they feel like they need more data from Joe Biden. This idea of, well, he's been hiding, he's in his basement, I haven't seen him, or is he too old? Is he up to it? Those things are landing with people. And so people who are gettable for him have a kind of skepticism where they're really waiting to see what he says. Is he lurching far left, which is their great fear? Does he seem like he's not up to it? Those are data points that people are still looking for. Now, look, if we were going to vote right now today in a non-COVID environment, he'd win in a landslide, because, I just did a quick spin through the Real Clear Politics average. He's up by 5 points in Florida, which frankly would break Trump's back. He's up by 6.5 in Wisconsin, which is I've long thought was going to be one of the toughest places for him to win. He's up by 6.4 in Pennsylvania. He's up by 2 in Arizona, which has been a reliably red state for a long time. He's up 6.7 in Michigan, which is starting to look like it's out of reach. He's pulled out of even advertising there. The only state that's looking really narrow and has been doing some narrowing is North Carolina. That's kind of been on the list. So right now he looks like he's in a good position, but people have to be aware of how big a deal it could be if he comes out in these debates and confirms for people that he's not up to it for some reason, if he looks like that, or if it plays to that thing. Now, on the other hand, Trump could be so lowering the bar and expectations for Joe Biden by defining him that way, that Joe Biden comes out, sounds like a normal, reasonable person, and he far exceeds expectations. Could break either way, but those sort of known unknowns are all still out there, and it's all about to happen when people are going to start really tuning in.
Matt.
Well, I am allergic to optimism because I started my political career working for Mike Dukakis, so we knew we were going to lose that one. And then we had a good couple of election nights in 92 and 96. And then we had a string of really bad ones. So in 2000, we celebrated our victory. And then in 2004, we celebrated our victory. And I'm talking like 7 p.m. on election night. I'm not talking 89 days before. And then, of course, in 2016. So I am suffering, like most Democrats, severe PTSD on election night, watching the New York Times arrow. So I cannot become complacent, and I will not. And I think Sarah's exactly right on some of the things that could go wrong. I am not particularly worried about the debates. A lot of people have focused on this, but I'll tell you that Joe Biden is not bad at debating. If you think about the last debate he had during the primaries against Bernie Sanders, it was on the Sunday after South Carolina, and it was just the two of them, and he did pretty well. And in his debates against Sarah Palin, which was a high-risk situation for him, he was very disciplined, and he did well, in most of the debates that he's had in the last 15 years. So I think he'll be prepared. I think he'll take it very seriously, and I think the debates are going to go okay. What we don't know is other things, other shoes that could drop. Some of them could be typical October surprises that change the nature of the vote. In other words, it could move people to vote for Trump or not to vote for Biden. And there's all kinds of things that could happen with the shenanigans that Trump could pull around the logistics of voting and the counting of the votes. So am I completely sanguine that Joe Biden will be president at 12:01 p.m. on January 20th? I am not, and I don't think anybody should be.
So I think this question around what it'll actually look like on election night and whether we are going to have free and fair elections, whether the losing side will accept the outcome of the election. Those are all really important questions. I want to get to them at the end of the conversation. But before we get there, one simple question to ask, which I think is important, is, why is it that right now Biden is ahead, as Sarah was saying, by so much in states like Florida and Wisconsin and so on? Is it that Biden is winning, or is it that Trump is losing? What are the reasons for why the race looks like it does right now? And what does that tell us about how likely it is to be stable?
Yeah, so I do think it's a little bit of both. I do think Joe Biden is winning in part by virtue of being Joe Biden. I think that he was absolutely the right choice to run against Donald Trump. Now, I'm an annoying never Trumper that a lot of folks on the left, are get aggravated by because we're looking for the most moderate Dem that we can find.
According to a recent article, and I should have introduced you all for a little bit more detail, but Sarah Longwell, for those who don't know, was a longtime Republican, a leader of the log cabin Republicans, who's been a leading never Trumper and one of the people who started and is the publisher of Bulwark. So according to a recent article in the New Republic, it is actually because of you and Bill Kristol and a couple of other people that Bernie Sanders is not our nominee. So we're talking to a very powerful person here, at least in the imagination of some people.
Yeah, and I would love to take credit for that. I am more than happy to accept. I think he thinks it's blame. I would certainly accept it as credit because I think that Bernie Sanders would absolutely be losing to Donald Trump. Now, one of the things that I guess though that there's a second part to this question, which is in the last 6 months, the environment has completely changed. And so one of the things that the questions that people have asked through this entire election or post in this Trump era is, why is he doing so well? Why isn't everybody seeing what we're seeing? And people sort of started to get really stuck in this idea that he really could do anything without consequence, which of course culminated in sort of his impeachment and no Republican doing anything against him. And so, it's this idea that Donald Trump sort of couldn't be beaten had really cemented in people's heads, but I had always argued it would take an exogenous event. Like the political environment can change. I mean, when Donald Trump had a rock solid economy, that's different from a COVID. Like he now has a health crisis, a financial crisis, and a racial crisis, all of which demonstrate to people that he is not up to the task. Now, he still maintains his base, and that's never going to go anywhere. But that environment makes a real difference. And that is where it's less about Joe Biden winning and more about Donald Trump losing. And so if he were head to head with Bernie Sanders in the same environment, I don't know that I could predict. But if this environment were taken out of it and he were having to run head to head, I would much rather have him against Joe Biden than Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders is who he wanted to run against. It was who he was trying to get voters to turn out from his own party to vote for Bernie Sanders so he could run against him, because he needs to run against socialism. If you listen to Republicans right now, they are on message about the left being super far left and being socialists. I hear it in the focus groups all the time. It lands with people. But the good news is it doesn't quite stick to Biden. And so to the extent that is Biden winning, I think part of it is he does pick up both some Obama-Trump voters, some white working class voters, where you see some of Trump's support eroding for the first time, especially with women. But Trump is also losing because he's been tested for the first time in real and meaningful ways and been found wanting.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I am an annoying moderate Democrat who spent much of the last 18 months trying to ensure that my party would nominate somebody that could beat Trump. And I was pretty convinced, along with Sarah, that had we nominated Bernie and we came relatively close, or at least seemed like we were, that would be very, very bad and very, very difficult. And I remain convinced that if Bernie were our nominee right now, we would be in serious trouble. That is, an impossible debate to have because it's trying to prove a negative, but it is, I think, without a doubt that the Trump campaign was going to try to stick the socialist label on whomever we nominated. And had it been a guy who said he was a socialist, that would be easier than a guy who clearly is not. The other thing I think is that re-elections for president are almost always referenda on that president. And sometimes that's very good for the challenger, as it is this cycle. And sometimes it's very bad, as it was in 1996. When I was working for Bill Clinton in 96, Bob Dole didn't have a chance because we were at peace. The economy was booming, not as much as it was gonna boom, but was already well on its way to historic highs. And if you asked people, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? The answer was, we definitely are. So that kind of referendum, really tough to be a challenger. And frankly, had COVID not come along, notwithstanding all of the horror and chaos of the Trump years and all of the things that we could have used to prosecute Trump, it would have been hard to beat him with any of our crop of candidates because he had 3.1% unemployment. The economy seemed relatively good to most people, and that would have been tough. But the reason I think we're winning is that it has become a referendum on Trump. Things are going very poorly. And most importantly, people can connect Trump and his problems to their own problems. In 2016, especially after the Access Hollywood tape came out, the case that we litigated against Donald Trump was he's a terrible person. And voters said, yeah, he's a terrible person. I wouldn't want him to date my daughter. But he's not going to have any effect on me, and maybe he'll shake things up in Washington. Now our case is he's a terrible president, and that is having a huge impact on you. And that, I think, is going to be much more effective.
Yeah, I think, social scientists and philosophers distinguish between necessary and sufficient conditions. And then there's the slightly puzzling category of a jointly sufficient condition. I think you've convinced me in these comments that both of those factors are necessary. I notice this very strongly, but when I talk about the dangers of populism, people often think, well, all of these sort of right-wing populists, they seem bad in all these different kinds of ways. I get that. But you know what? Actually, my life is fine. And it seems bad that they're attacking these institutions and so on. But really, who cares? This is an elite game. It doesn't really affect me. And I feel like a lot of people still felt like that about Donald Trump in January of this year, for example. And now the pandemic has hit. I think in those countries where populists have dealt with it badly. And there's a couple of them where populists have dealt with it okay. But there's many where they've dealt with it badly, including in India and Brazil and Mexico and here in the United States. Suddenly people get that argument in a different way. And like, oh yes, actually, one of the reasons why we're failing to deal with this is all the things that people warned about Trump all this way along, but he doesn't actually care about people, that he's not responsible, that he doesn't believe experts, but he's happy to lie, but he'll just say anything that makes him look good, even though it completely doesn't correspond with reality. But then I think you're also right that Democrats need to manage the risk of being perceived as themselves sort of so radical that a lot of voters who Biden needs in order to win would be scared of him. So I guess my question is, if you were, let me ask both questions. I think the answer to the first question may be obvious, which is if you were a Biden campaign advisor, what would you say? I'm going to hazard a guess. Keep doing what you're doing. Be the alternative that everybody can sort of get along with. Have a clear program and criticize Trump very, very clearly for all the things for which he deserves to be criticized, but don't rock the boat too much. I'm guessing that's the answer, but perhaps you disagree, and that would be interesting. What do you think Trump should be doing? Because one of the things that I'm struck by in Trump's messaging so far is that it seems he doesn't have a clear theme. Make America Great Again was a very clear theme, and he's played with lots of different models this year, and he hasn't really come up with one. And now he sort of seems to be back to Make America Great Again, which is ironic since he's supposedly had 4 years to do that. But also his attack lines on the Democrats seem a little confused, right? So Joe Biden is both Sleepy Joe and he's a left-wing radical. And Kamala Harris is both, a horrible, dangerous woman from California who you shouldn't trust in any number of dimensions. And also, by the way, she was a cop when she was attorney general, so she was too right-wing. I mean, it just seems like there's no coherence in the message. If they were to find a coherence, what would it be, and would that make a difference? Why don't we start with Matt and then go to Sarah?
Okay, and I'll just say that Sarah's colleague, Tim Miller at The Bulwark, has a great piece about that incoherence, particularly as it relates to Harris, that came out a few days ago, and it's exactly right. They cannot figure out what they want to do. In part, it's because they have a candidate who is the least disciplined political candidate in American history. I mean, they cannot count on him to carry out anything that the campaign comes up with as a strategic vision. So, but it is striking because in 2016, if you compare the two campaigns, the Clinton campaign had 298 policy ideas on their website. We counted them, 298. They went from Alzheimer's to Zika, and they were beautiful. They were paid for, and they were sensible, and they were great. And the Trump campaign had 7 policy ideas on its website. And one of those ideas was respect the police, which is not a policy idea. So what Trump realized in 2016 was none of that nonsense that people like all of us pay attention to ultimately matters in the outcome. What matters is having a coherent narrative. And the narrative that he spun, as you noted, Make America Great Again. And the way he promised to do that was to build 2 walls, one real wall and one metaphoric wall around the country. He was going to protect the country from brown people and immigrants and foreign entanglements and trade. And he was going to bring us back to some magical past where if you had a high school diploma and you were a white guy, life was good. This time, because he is president and because he is in the middle of 2 continually cascading crises, he cannot figure out what his coherent narrative is. And I'm not sure that one is on offer. I don't think that he has the opportunity to have any kind of coherent narrative other than don't change horses midstream, which is generally what you would run on as an incumbent in the middle of a crisis. So I think they are hurting, which is great news, seems to me, for my team and for the world. And I'm not sure what I would advise them if I were inside that camp.
Well, I mean, I know what I would advise them if I were in the camp, which is like he would fare far better if he started to do his job. I mean, the thing that he could do to help, he can bring every advisor in to find a way to attack Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, but none of that would be as effective as him looking like he was doing the job in front of him. right? That he was taking COVID seriously, that he was making headway on things like vaccinations, and he was talking about, more optimistic things all the day, that they were, passing legislation, that they were going to send people checks. Like there's a lot of things they could be doing to help themselves out that they're not doing because they're completely politically inept. But look, I think there's a couple kind of meat and potatoes Republican playbook things that they could go back to that could be effective. And one of the biggest ones right now, and I hear it in the focus groups a lot, is the protests that are happening now in Seattle and Portland. And there was one recently in Chicago where people broke the windows of a Ronald McDonald House that had parents and their sick children inside of it. Okay, so like the optics, and here's the thing. There was a period of time where everyone understood that the chaos they were seeing on the streets, whether it was peaceful protests or whether it was something way worse, were in some ways the anger was kind of generated by the killing of George Floyd. And people understood that we were grappling with something big here in terms of systemic racism. I hear in my focus groups all the time from suburban women that they need to start listening more to other people's experiences. They really recoil at Trump's racism. But the sort of wanton violence and the looting is A, divorced now from the George Floyd killing. It is not connected. And B, people hate it. Regular, voters hate it and they notice it. And I think that Trump is very ham-handedly sort of doing like tweeting law and order and just, but they could get more sophisticated about this and have a slightly more nuanced message. I mean, he can keep tweeting about suburban housewives and like hang himself, which by the way, just in terms of your bigger question, which is, what is Joe Biden, should Joe Biden be doing something differently? You never want to interrupt your opponent when he's committing suicide, which is essentially what Donald Trump has been doing. But that being said, I am a big believer that come Labor Day, Joe Biden has to be more present than he is today. I mean, I think that people are going to look for an affirmative reason to vote for him. And if he's still polling +8 and he's got 6-point leads in a bunch of the key swing states, then maybe they make the judgment to use him sparingly. But I do think he's got to get out there and show people why they need to cast an affirmative vote for him, because he is really undefined. For a guy who's been in politics for 40 years and who was vice president to the most recent president, he is, especially among the people that I talk to, I hear it all the time. These are Republicans or right-leaning independents or just regular Americans who don't pay that much attention to politics. They didn't watch the Democratic primaries. They didn't have an opinion on half the people I pitched to them as the potential VP person because they never heard of them. And so I think that Joe Biden is going to have to really make both the case for himself as the uniter and get out there and really hit those themes hard in person, show people he's there, he's with it, and not let Trump, because Trump still has a lot of money and can do a lot. He did this to Hillary, just dumped buckets of money defining her negatively. It's not sticking to Biden as much, but you never know what could take hold. And you also don't know what in the environment can change. Maybe there is a vaccine. And just think about how psychological, think all of us know this. We've been trapped inside our houses for forever. We can't live our normal lives. Our kids can't see their grandparents. We're sad, right? Every focus group I see, one of the things that's so present is how much pain there is out there. So imagine that in October, the October surprise is actually that we start to have some hope as a country, that the economy starts to pick up and there's a vaccine on the horizon and people start thinking, oh man, maybe we're going to get this. Those kinds of things can change too.
Very quick round. Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Just quickly on Sarah's point about post-Labor Day, I very much agree. I am an old advanced guy. That's where I started my career. And first, I mourn for the advanced people of 2020. They are completely unemployed and sad. But also, I do believe in the power of political events. And it doesn't mean we're not going to have big rallies. Nobody's going to have those. But there are things that Joe Biden can and should do, I think, after Labor Day, that will define him. He can go and meet in small groups of people. He can take tours. He can stand in front of important things and drive his message home, either about himself or about Trump. And I think both he and Harris need to be doing that after Labor Day.
Yeah, Sarah kindly let me sit in on one of her focus groups, and I was struck by two things that she mentioned. The first is that when you asked these voters about all kinds of things about Trump, they were a little protective of him. I mean, the economy and COVID, like, well, he's not doing great, but it's hard, I mean, you asked them about race relations, and this was in the middle of June or so, and they were just angry. They didn't give a polite answer of like, well, he could be a little less inflammatory on Twitter. They were angry about the way he talks about that stuff. And coming from working class women in this case who had voted for Trump in 2016, I was struck by that. And I think that's important to underline. And I think it speaks actually to the great piece by Ihad Manji that we published today. The second thing is that they did feel sort of positively-ish about Biden, but they didn't seem to have a very strong sense of him. And Sarah showed them a bunch of ads, which some of the organizations she's involved with, including Republican voters against Trump, had produced. And the ones that were super highly sort of produced, some of the stuff by the Lincoln Project that people are really loving, seemed to leave them a little bit cold. The stuff that really was working is ordinary voters who had been Republicans all their life saying why they can't brook Trump. And then the other thing that I found very interesting is just actually showing Biden. I mean, after a minute of Biden just saying humbly, look, it's a tough job and everybody's going to get some things wrong, but I'm going to try hard in a way that the current president doesn't. That seemed to really speak to them. So perhaps that is actually a reason to think that Biden's lead might actually increase rather than narrow. But if he fails to take that opportunity, there could be a real narrowing. So very quick round, and then I want to switch to some of the more sort of game planning of what actually happens after the election questions. What's the single biggest mistake that Democrats or Biden could do to blow the election between now and November?
Well, the single biggest one, I think.
Well, it doesn't have to be the single biggest. You can list 7 if you have them. Give us your full list.
Yeah, I think it's got to be a little bit of a cocktail. I think the two narratives that are sticking right now that can either be proven or disproven by real life and what's going to happen over the next 2 months is, does Joe Biden fit the radical socialist model that Republicans are trying to paint him as? And does he seem up to the job when people get a real look at him? And I'll just say on the socialist thing, one of the things that's interesting is Joe Biden is doing something that is different from basically every other presidential candidate ever, which is that they run to the left in a primary and they run to the middle in a general. And he is doing the opposite of that, where he ran as like the most moderate guy in this like crowded field of progressives. And now to shore up his progressive wing, he's like, yeah, AOC will run my, environmental stuff. And so I think that kind of thing can go wrong for him if people start to feel like, wait a minute, you don't sound like a centrist at all, or you don't sound moderate at all. And they're putting a lot of money behind making him into the scary socialist. That is the thing. I hear it in the focus groups all the time. People don't like Trump, but man, they don't like the far left either.
Yeah, I am not particularly worried about this question because I think there's almost nothing Joe Biden could do to just fumble the ball entirely on his own. I think because it's a referendum election, it's going to be much more about Trump. And I think that this question is in tension with the previous one about whether Biden should be out there more. And I lean much more in that direction. He is going to make mistakes. He always makes mistakes when he goes out. The question is, are any of these even close to fatal? And I think they're not. He did the thing about African-American voters, and he gets himself all twisted around the axle sometimes. And that causes huge amounts of heartburn and hand-wringing inside Democratic circles. But in the end, I don't think it has a huge impact. If he bombs a debate, that could be very bad because he may look like he's not up to it. But I think short of that, not much he could do.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I think in many things, the two of you are quite simpatico here. There's a little bit of a tension, I think, and how worried you are about the possibility of this. It seems to me that on cultural questions, one of Biden's sort of underappreciated strengths is that he's sort of neither woke nor anti-woke. He's sort of too old to be woke or anti-woke, right? And so he's just a guy who stands for decent things and who wants injustices in this country to be remedied, and who's not a bad person. And I think that speaks, both sides can live with that in a way that would be much harder, I think, for a politician who's been more shaped by the current sort of form that the sort of cultural war can take in the United States. And I wonder if that's the same on the economy too. I mean, I certainly agree that if people came to see him as a socialist, that would do real damage to his electoral prospects. I wonder whether he could transform himself into that. I mean, will people ever look at Joe Biden and say, that guy is out to just radically reshape, the America I know, and I'm afraid that if he wins, he's gonna, take my house away in the way that Donald Trump is trying to insinuate in, his tweets about the suburbs and so on. So perhaps, Sarah, you look like you have a.
Well, the only thing I would say is that, look, the Democrats and Republicans both have their most fundamental thing that they offer people. And for Dems, it's we're going to pay for a bunch of stuff. Let me tell you what we're going to pay for. You get a free thing. You get a free thing. Republicans are we're not going to raise your taxes. We're not going to take the hard-earned money that you gave and give it to somebody you don't like. And I do think that that is a compelling message. I right now I'm listening to the Slate slow burn about David Duke. And one of the things that I was just listening to an episode about the way that he won his congressional seat was he ran mostly on lowering people's taxes. And so I just think, and when I listen to people in the focus groups, they are still very much institutionally Republicans. And I do worry about people coming home on some level because, and granted, I think there's a small chance of this, but I think there's a real chance of this, that at some point, because here's the problem. Donald Trump starts acting like a normal person and the media throws him a ticker tape parade. They're look at that presidential speech where he read off a teleprompter effectively for 40 minutes. Who could have thought? This is amazing. He's basically the greatest president ever. And so whenever, and he did this in 2016 where there was this moment, right, when Kellyanne came in, they basically got him on script for a little bit and everyone was well, maybe he could do this. He doesn't seem terrible. You forget how short people's memories are. And so I'm not saying it's a likelihood. I'm just saying it's plausible. And yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, I think that's right in normal times. I'm not sure the everything's free frame works as well when we're in the middle of an economic depression. And I think, that has scrambled things quite a bit. The other thing I'll say is the thing that Joe Biden has that other candidates in the field running for the nomination didn't have is his narrative of affinity. My dad took the long walk up the stairs in Scranton and we had to move and it's genuine. This is not a guy that seems like a phony because he's not a phony. He did live that life. He understands people that live that life. And I know Sarah talks to people near Scranton all the time. And I don't know and I know they don't buy that he's from Scranton, but the notion that he understands what it is to live paycheck to paycheck, what it is to have real anxiety about your economic future day to day, I think that is going to serve him pretty well and is going to insulate him some from he's a nutcase socialist.
But that's why they need to meet him, because I do think this is why he has to define himself. I agree with you that so much of this depends on whether Joe Biden can prosecute his own narrative in the way, you brought up how well he did in that debate with Sarah Palin, and I agree, but that was a decade ago now? It was a long time ago. And so I think the question is can Joe Biden sort of get people to see him as that empathetic figure that has this great story to tell, who really genuinely understands their pain? Because I will tell you, if he can connect with people on that level, and Yasha's so right, when you show a Biden ad to these group of soft Trump supporters, they love it. Because it's Joe Biden sounding like he's going to take care of them. He's going to unite the country. And hey, he's not perfect. And he's going to make mistakes, but he's going to try his best for them. And they love that message. They're here for that. The question is, will they get that message? Will it, because Ann Applebaum's got a great piece where she talks about we're just living in these different information bubbles. And it's so hard to break through. And so much of that's got to come from Biden himself. And it's so hard when the media is just constantly focused on Trump.
So I guess, my 2 cents on this is that we've become a little bit traumatized by the idea that you can turn perfectly reasonable people into evil monsters whom everybody fears. And that certainly, I think, was a story of 2016. I think, Hillary Clinton's negative approval ratings were as high as those of Donald Trump throughout most of the campaign, and I think even on the day of the actual election. So people didn't like Trump in 2016, but they really hated and feared Hillary. Now, I happen to think that that's quite unfair. I have my criticisms of her, without a doubt, but I don't think she's a bad person. I think she generally wanted good things for the country, but people did not believe that. I think with Biden, for any number of reasons, I think Hillary was actually more special than we acknowledge in that way. Including just the fact that she had been demonized for decades by the Republican press, including the fact that she was a woman and all kinds of other things that made her more vulnerable to that narrative. And I just think, I'm having trouble thinking that somebody who isn't a hardcore Trump fan anyway, who isn't going to vote for Republicans every election anyway, is really going to hate Joe Biden. Is really going to fear Joe Biden. I find it hard to think that we'll get there. But I want to make sure, because I promised that we would talk about election security and some of those things. So there's rising concerns both about whether or not the vote will in fact be counted fairly, especially given that in these pandemic circumstances, a lot of the vote will be a postal vote, and more Democrats are going to vote by post than by mail than Republicans, according to some predictions. And then the possibility that, as the president has floated, he might not accept the outcome of the election. I mean, so how worried should we be that if Joe Biden does win, he wins a majority of the vote in the states he needs to win a majority in the Electoral College, but a lot of those are postal votes, but Trump refuses to accept the outcome of the election? How worried should we be about some of those scenarios that are keeping people up at night at the moment?
Well, go ahead, sir.
No, you go first.
All right. So I've been thinking about this pretty much nonstop for about a month, and there's many scenarios whereby he can screw with the electoral process. But the vote by mail one is the most troubling to me for two reasons. One is the obvious, slowing down the mail could keep ballots from arriving on time to be counted. So if they're not postmarked or whatever the state rules are in time, they will not count, and more Democrats by large margins are going to vote by mail than Republicans. So that could actually affect the outcome. But if you presume that the outcome is basically correct, the other thing that is going to happen is Trump is going to have days or probably weeks to complain that the election's being stolen from him. And in the 10 states where the election is going to be decided, the 6 principal swing states plus, Iowa, Texas, Ohio, Georgia, in all 10, Republicans control both houses of the state legislature. And under the Constitution, that means that they could appoint their own electors. They could ignore the outcome of the popular vote and certify that Trump is the winner in their state, because you can't trust the outcome of the electoral vote because vote by mail is a fraud. And with Trump saying this every minute of every day, amplified by the primetime hosts on Fox and 9 trillion other right-wing outlets, there's going to be pressure on these Republicans in the state legislatures to do that. In 6 of those 10, and in 2 of the 6 biggest swing states, there are Republican governors as well. So my nightmare is that Biden wins in a state like Arizona, which has a Republican governor, but the legislature concludes that Trump should get the electoral votes, and Ducey, the governor, signs that. And then we have either a controversy when Congress counts the votes on January 6th, or Trump just gets those electoral votes, notwithstanding the fact that he may have lost the popular vote in that state. That seems far-fetched, but that could happen.
So just for one piece of important background here, one of the strange things is that in many states, a large percentage of a postal vote will not be counted on election day.
Right.
And if more Democrats use the postal vote than Republicans, then we'll have this very strange situation in which the majority of votes counted on election day in a lot of those states may be Republican, and yet it may be clear to election experts the Democrats have in fact won, and that over the next days, the tally for Democrats keeps going up, and suddenly Florida goes from -1% for Biden to +4% for Biden. But that will look strange to Americans who have not experienced that in past election cycles, and will lend the veneer of plausibility to claims that something very strange is going on here and you shouldn't trust any of that. So that's what makes that scenario even scarier.
Yeah, and this happens even in non-pandemic times. In Pennsylvania in 2016, Hillary's vote went up by 22,000 votes in Pennsylvania after Election Day, because there is this thing called the blue shift. More Democrats vote by mail, more Democrats have proxy votes or provisional votes, excuse me, and those take time to count. So there's always a shift towards the Democrats, almost always. In 2018, Martha McSally was ahead in the Arizona Senate race on election night by a point, and she ended up losing 10 days later because there was the blue shift towards Sinema. And that is going to happen on steroids this time because more Democrats are going to vote by mail.
Sarah, is Matt too worried or insufficiently worried?
No, I am, as a nominal conservative, I am reluctant always to hit panic buttons, to overemphasize things that I think are probably not going to happen. So, for example, I think that it is probably not going to happen that Trump loses and just refuses to leave office. Like, I think that is implausible. I think that people shouldn't, I worry about people even talking about it like that, because I worry that talking about it makes it alive in a way that it shouldn't be, or lowers the standards of what we think we'll accept. But I am deeply concerned about the vote by mail issue. And, part of it is Trump is telling us, as he does, exactly what his plan is and what he's trying to do. He wants to sow distrust in the veracity, or he calls the voting by mail a fraud. Voting absentee is fine, though, despite the fact that they're essentially the same thing. They're walking Kanye West's ballots into, the Wisconsin GOP's based trying to get him on the ballot. And Kanye West says right out loud, yeah, this is to hurt Biden. Like, this is a strategy to try to siphon off some votes. Like, normally that kind of thing, people would be freaking out about that. But the problem is a kind of numbness that Trump has lulled us all into, this complacency where we're like, yeah, he's going to try to do these things. And this thing with the post office, I follow a lot of my old colleagues and friends who are conservatives on Twitter, who are doing this thing right now where it's like, well, yeah, but the post office has always been an issue. They're just using this as a reason to get a bunch more funding. And this is they're calling the post office sort of panic a conspiracy theory. The problem with calling it a conspiracy theory, and I could see myself 5 years ago being like, let's settle down, people. Problem is, Trump went on television and said, I don't want to give the post office money because I don't want everybody voting by mail, because he also has said on TV, if everybody votes by mail, Republicans lose. Like, this guy has told us in a very straightforward way, because he can't help himself, that he doesn't want people voting, that he thinks more voting is bad for him. He's doing it to what might even be his own detriment in places like Florida, where a lot of older people would vote by mail. But he is going to do everything he can to make it so that on election night, and keep one thing in mind, if on election night right now, the expectations, even as you said at the outset, the expectation right now is that Joe Biden is going to win, and win by a lot. If it is super close and everybody remembers 2016 very well, which everybody does, there will be a real sense of giving Trump the benefit of the doubt that he has done it again, that the pollsters were wrong, that the elites were wrong. And so you cannot count, especially if in that scenario, he has dramatically underperformed expectations. And so if you think about the psychology of that, he will have a lot of room for the media will feel pretty paralyzed by what's going on. And so I don't think that it's just a Fox News problem. I think that it will create an environment in which there is a lot of uncertainty, and he'll have all the levers of the federal government at his disposal when it comes to, hey, Bill Barr decides, look, there was some voter fraud in Arizona. Somebody voted by mail and showed up at the polling place. We need to stop counting. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but there's a lot of scenarios in which this could go sideways. And Matt made a point that I think is super important, or no, Yasha made it. This election's going to look different, and that's going to make it seem weird to people. It just is going to look different because of the pandemic.
Great. Let's go to the audience for questions. A reminder not to try to unmute yourself, because you can't, and you will only manage to mute yourself in the process. So let's start with Alphonse. Alphonse, sorry, you're actually muted, and for some reason... Yeah, go ahead.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, it works. Hi, yes, hi everybody. I wanted to, Mr. Barrett, to elaborate a little bit about this issue of the legislature of the states which decide to do so, as they can do it under the Constitution of the United States, decide to disregard altogether the popular vote and to appoint delegates to the Electoral College to vote for Trump. I mean, if that happens, taking the excuse of the postal service, of the votes, of the confusion, all of these kind of things, if they do it, there is, as far as I know, from a legal point of view, there is no way to stop that because the states can appoint delegates whenever they want, not whenever, but by the way they want, they freely want, not by elections. So if it happens, how could American democracy react?
So it's not quite that clear that they can just do it because it hasn't happened in 150 years, and the process is a little bit complicated. In the states that have Democratic governors, and of the top 6 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona, 4 of them have Democratic governors, 2 have Republicans. In a state that has a Democratic governor, let's say it's Wisconsin, what would happen in all likelihood is that the legislature would meet and say, we're going to appoint Trump delegates, despite the fact that the popular vote appears to be for Biden. But the governor would refuse to sign that certification that is then sent to the National Archives and to Congress. And the governor, along with probably the Secretary of State, would certify the Biden electors. So both sets of electors would end up in Congress. And then there's a very elaborate process to figure out whether one or neither of those slates should be recognized. So it's a complicated process. In the states, though, where the Republicans control the governor, like in Arizona, the governor would sign that, and the Trump claim would be stronger to those electoral votes. Keep in mind, though, that this would be an unbelievably radical act. This would be the legislature ignoring the popular vote of their own state, their own citizens. And so, the guardrails of our democracy that remain would suggest that you can't do that. You can't simply ignore your own citizens. But if there is enough credible if there's an idea that fraud was involved, then they may be willing to go that far.
So, Sarah, you know some of the actors that will be involved in that decision, and of course, a good number of state legislatures and state governors are probably Trumpified, but a good number of them are sort of all-star Republicans who've been going along with Trump because he's the president, but may not privately be great fans of him. I mean, do you think there is a realistic scenario in which Arizona, say, which is a state I believe that has a Republican House, Senate, and governor, would do something as radical as that?
I don't, and especially not Ducey. Like, I think Ducey is a pretty good governor, and I think that I wouldn't be hugely worried about that. I think what I'm more worried about isn't quite the scenario that Matt paints, as it is like what happens when there's tons of confusion. Okay, and so when there's real confusion, and this is key, the race is extremely narrow. So imagine that it's like Florida in 2000, but across multiple states that are decisive, that do have Republican-led legislatures, that do have courts that are now populated by Republican judges, and that there's a lot of like confusion because there are now instances of credible allegations of fraud. And so everybody's trying to say like, okay, slow down. And at that point, there's all kinds of room for things to go haywire, depending on who wants to make them go haywire. So it's more that if there should be anything that people take away from this, is that Joe Biden's victory, and this is why no one should be complacent, he can't win by 3 million votes, certainly in the popular vote. He can't win by 5 million votes in the popular vote. He needs to win by 8 million popular votes. He needs to win by 4% in all of the swing states. Like, it has to be decisive and a blowout, not just so that we're sure about who wins and there's no gray area for Trump to kind of sneak in and make things scarier, but also if there's going to ever be a hope of having a responsible center-right party in this country, you can't just beat Trump, you got to beat Trumpism, which means that he needs to be thoroughly repudiated. And so for anybody who's been feeling good out there and thinking, I don't need to put that much more into this seems pretty baked, I would encourage you to put absolutely everything you can into this election, because the margins matter for a whole bunch of very, very important reasons.
Perhaps let's take a couple of questions together. Let's go to Corinne and then Karen. Go ahead.
Hello. I'm curious about what your thoughts on Kamala Harris as the new VP, especially compared to like Susan Rice and Tammy Duckworth and the other runners-up for VP, and whether she helps or hurts Biden in the long run. I'm personally really excited, and I say this as a never Trump Republican who is excited. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are in general. Was that a good move on Biden's part? Great,
and let's hear from Karen, and then we can cycle back for answers.
Sure. I guess I kind of wanted to throw a little spoke in the wheel because I'm kind of everyone's here's nightmare. I've been a registered independent for several years, was a registered Democrat, voted Democrat all through 2016, and I am on the fence about who I'm voting for. And I, in many days, am leaning towards Trump. And when I find on the left that there's, as it was in 2016, like a refusal to take seriously either Trump or whatever it is that Trump offers. And the argument has been, well, Donald Trump is a horrible person and we're moral and vote for us. But that is not what I see as a swing voter. And what I see is a presidential candidate and a vice president who referred to the presidential candidate as a rapist and a racist. And I watched this happen. I'm not getting this from media. Like, I watched it happen in the Democratic debates. And I personally find it morally repugnant. And so there's just this denial about looking at whatever the moral repugnancies are on both sides and realizing that that's what a lot of people see, is they see two morally repugnant sides and they have to pick which one is less morally or whatever, which is the best one. And I just wanted to throw that out there as just something to think about.
Matt, Sarah.
I'm going to take Corinne's question and I'm going to have Sarah answer Karen's question because she's been talking to folks exactly like you for a long time. Corinne, I'll just, speaking as the Democrat here, I'll say that I was very excited about him picking Harris. I think she was exactly the right pick, and a couple of reasons. One is she didn't run a fantastic presidential campaign, but the very things that made her a relatively lackluster presidential candidate aren't going to have any impact now. She got herself a little bit bollocksed up on some policy questions that she hadn't thought through all the way, like Medicare for All, which I oppose, and she kind of opposed and then was for and then opposed. That doesn't matter now. She supports what Joe Biden supports. And that is, crystal clear. When you join the national ticket, your policy initiatives are shelved and you are for who the person at the top of the ticket, what that person wants. And if you wonder about that, ask anyone that's ever run for vice president, because that is what happens. So I think the things that made her a strong candidate, she is charismatic and very smart and very tough, I think will make her a very strong vice presidential candidate. And then I would just say one other thing about Susan Rice, who I know and like very much. I was the communications director on Wes Clark's presidential campaign when he ran for president in 2004. And Wes Clark is a brilliant guy who had served at the highest levels of national security and diplomacy. He was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, just as she has. The thing is, watching him run for president was like watching Michael Jordan play baseball. Very talented person, great athlete, wrong sport. And I think that's what we would have had with Susan in a political role, but I think she'd be an awesome Secretary of State.
Sarah.
So I don't know that I want to get into a whole back and forth, but I'm trying to test the premise of the question that you asked, Karen, which is that did you say that the vice president, that Kamala accused Joe Biden of being a rapist?
That I didn't see personally, although I heard that she had accepted the accusations of the woman who accused him of rape. And I did see her imply that he was a racist at the Democratic debates.
Oh, a racist, yeah, a racist.
Right, and so, yeah. And so to me, and then she apparently admitted when questioned about it, that, well, it was a debate, that's what you do when it's a debate, which is really okaying that if you want to win something, it's okay to say somebody is like a horrible person, and and that's not okay with me personally. I don't find that like morally virtuous.
Yeah. So okay. So I got a couple things. One is I think I agree with you on certain elements of this, which is that I think there are she part of the reason that she failed as a candidate a little bit is because she did things like go after Joe Biden on busing and did sort of imply he was racist only to herself. Then when pushed on her own position, realized that it was basically the same as Joe Biden's. And that was, and also I think, look, when the Me Too era has presented, I think some real challenges for these politicians who want to say all women need to be heard at the same time of saying, but I heard her and she's not credible. And so they sound pretty, it cannot sound great. Now that being said, I don't know that I want to go straight to whataboutism, but I gotta say that when it comes to morality, so Donald Trump has 20 plus sexual assault allegations against him. He is, and it takes a lot for me to call somebody racist. But this is a guy who says, go back to your own country, to American women of color, who launched his entire political career on a racist conspiracy theory. You want to talk about being mean in the debates? Like Donald Trump said that Ted Cruz's dad murdered JFK. Like conspiracy, insane nonsense. He's been accusing Joe Scarborough of murdering an intern on TV for the last 6 months instead of dealing with a pandemic. Like to me, I hear a lot of people, and I'm usually doing focus groups, so I actually don't get to answer like this. But I find when people sort of say I don't know, I feel like these things are equivalent. It just doesn't land right with me, because what I watch is somebody of, historic incompetence and moral deprivation against somebody who is imperfect, but who is every day sort of trying to be like a good version of himself. And I feel like it's easy to distinguish between those two things, especially when one person is like, I'm here to unite people, and the other one's very much saying I'm here to divide people.
All right, let's, sorry, I want to make sure, because we're at 4 p.m. Let's take 3 more questions very quickly from Michael, Kate, and Paul, and then we'll do one last round of answers. And then if anybody wants to hang out and debate those questions further, including you, hopefully, Karen, we can always do that. So let's go to Michael and then Kate.
Oh, hi. So I'm here in Utah, where we've had mail-in voting for quite a while. We've had a lot of time to work out the kinks. We've even had close elections. I mean, it's hard to believe, it's a red state, but the congressional election between Ben McAdams and Mia Love, the Democrat McAdams actually narrowly won. So it is true that mail-in voting can work, but I think Democrats are way too complacent that mail-in voting is going to be fine. You keep seeing memes that say, oh, mail-in voting is fine because you mail in your tax returns, blah, 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 right? But the truth is that it's going to be hard for states that have never done it before. They haven't worked out the kinks. And it seems like where the Trump administration is putting the goalposts, it seems like they're doing a bunch of stuff to make it look like they're sabotaging the post office and rigging the election. And it feels like the goalposts are there where maybe eventually everyone will call him out on that, and he'll say, okay, well, I'll stop purposely sabotaging it. But that wouldn't be a solution. What we actually need is a positive effort, a lot of funding to actually get this right. And I see where the goalposts are, I don't see that happening. Because if anything, he'll just agree to stop sabotaging it, but he'll never agree to actually do a positive effort to solve the problem.
Great, and let's go to Kate.
Yeah, so my question is, as sort of an average citizen, what is the best thing I can do to throw everything at helping Biden win this election? I'm going to vote here in Massachusetts, where it doesn't matter. But, should I be sending Joe Biden lots of money that if I can? Should I be phone banking for swing states? Should I be buying a lifetime supply of stamps? What is it that I can do? I think a lot of us feel a lot of anxiety and not much in the way of usefulness. So if you had sort of one tip for the average Joe who wants to do what we can, what would that be?
What can the average Joe do for Joe? And finally, Paul.
Thank you. I was actually quite keen to hear from Sarah on Kamala Harris, specifically whether he thinks that the Republicans would more successfully target her as a sort of as a progressive or a radical. I've seen quite a bit on Twitter from conservatives about how her voting record in the Senate is one of the most progressive, and she's voted 90% of the time with Bernie. I don't know if that's true, but if those things are true, even if they're not, how does she think maybe the Republicans? How successful does she think the Republicans could be in targeting Kamala as the woke side of the ticket?
Why don't I start with Michael and Kate? Michael is exactly right. He is moving the goalposts. He is likely to back down at some point about intentionally tanking the post office, because people are starting to get really upset about that, about medicine that they can't get, and small businesses are being crushed and checks aren't arriving. So he will eventually stop saying out loud, as Sarah said, that he's intentionally destroying the post office, but we will be left with this mess. And I think what Democrats have to do is, I think Pelosi should bring the House back tomorrow. And I think they should begin not only investigating, but saying every single day exactly what the problem is, and start to condition the electorate that we are not going to know who the president is on election day, because this guy has done this on purpose. We are trying to fix it, but it isn't going to get fixed before November 3rd. And you have to understand it's going to take some time to count these votes. To Kate's excellent question, this is a very bizarre presidential election for lots of reasons, but mostly because we're not doing the kinds of things you normally do. We're not setting up field offices all over northern Wisconsin and sending people out to knock on doors. But what that means for you in Massachusetts is that you can be just as impactful as the kid that would have moved himself to Racine to do that. You can be a volunteer for as many or as few hours per week as you like with the Biden campaign, with one of the close Senate races. I would recommend sticking to the 6 swing states if you're going to do something other than the Biden campaign, because anybody that turns out to vote in, let's say, the North Carolina Senate race for Cal Cunningham is also going to help Joe Biden. So definitely volunteer, give till it hurts, and buy as many stamps as you can. All of those were great ideas.
I'm not sure about the logic of the stamps. Wouldn't you buy up a supply of stamps or something? I'll let that pass.
We're going to shore up the post office, man. They need the money.
Oh, I see. That makes sense. All right, great.
Yeah, and on the question about Kamala, so I think that she was a fine choice, and in large part informed by the fact that I'm not sure he had too many better choices. I was testing with voters, the voters that I focus on, which are sort of these right-leaning independent, soft Trump supporters, and they'd never heard of Karen Bass, they'd never heard of Val Demings, so there was a lot of, the way that I always thought about the VP pick was, you start with Kamala and you say, well, but she didn't run a very good campaign, she's got these liabilities. Then you sort of tick through everybody else, and everybody else has a real Achilles heel, some of which is just flat out being untested. I mean, I look, Tammy Duckworth, I ran her, nobody had ever heard of her in my focus groups. So I told people the narrative about her, who she was, and they were all like, oh, that sounds awesome. The question is, though, what would she be like under the national spotlight? How would she perform? People don't know that. And those are big things when you're, you don't want a Sarah Palin type thing. So I thought, people say, I don't want to say that she was the safe choice, because I actually don't think picking a Black woman in America, it can be construed as safe. I do think you can say it's a consensus choice. And I see from, I see like the dude bros in Trump's universe, his advisors saying, oh, she's going to really scare the heck out of women in the suburbs. That I don't think at all. I think that she looks like women in the suburbs. I think she looks like the person who you drink wine with and is in your book club and is the smart person you like to hang out with. And so, in terms of the people who want to play to racial divisions where that exists, certainly there's plenty of, people on the Republican side who are going to do that, but I think it plays really poorly, and they should be awfully careful about that, because I think suburban voters think she's fine as long as she doesn't look. This whole defund the police type thing, that is a bad narrative for the burbs, and so they shouldn't lean into that. And I think as long as she sort of follows where Joe Biden's gone in terms of his instincts politically, she'll be good.
Thank you so much to everybody for a wonderful debate. A couple of notes. We have our usual happy hour this Thursday. It'll be at 8 p.m. We will also have a great debate next Sunday, which is about whether the internet and algorithms and a lot of tech developments that are going on are something we should celebrate, or something we should be afraid of, with Kathy O'Neill, who's a very interesting critic of a lot of Silicon Valley, and particularly the way in which algorithms are dangerous, according to her, as well as Martin Gurri, who's written a wonderful book about those technological changes and the political impacts they have, and I think sees them as real disruptors, but in a more positive light. So I think it's going to be a really interesting debate between the two of them. We also have great book clubs coming up. Not this week. I thought we will need a little bit of a break of our reading after a very intense schedule for the last few weeks, but we'll have great book clubs in the coming weeks. With Darren Strauss on how political literature should be, with David French on his new book, with Adam Gopnik on the history of French liberalism and some of the sort of seminal texts on liberalism, which I think will be a really great series of book clubs. So please go to www.persuasion.community to check those out if you're following us on YouTube, and hope to see you again very soon.